Welcome back to Pop Culture. This is week 3. You've made it. Congratulations. I appreciate you sending your videos, and we're going to have some fun this week. So without further ado, here's week 3 of Pop Culture. So I just want to address some of the questions and comments I had so far. First of all, Matthew Arnold is obviously speaking and writing at a different time than you, and it sounds difficult in some cases. And so I want you to think about, when you're reading any of the assigned readings for this class, a few questions, and they might be very different from what you're used to. So for example, if you're used to a high school class especially asking, what are the 3 main points, and here's a point form and you can fill in the blanks, and it's a very easy and simple regurgitation of the information. That's definitely not what I'm looking for here, and you'll see that in the questions that I'm asking and the kinds of discussions that we're going to have. So don't be taking notes when you're reading that look something like definition equals, definition equals, definition equals, because it's not going to be very helpful for what we're doing in cultural studies. Instead, here's some questions that I recommend you think about when you're reading anything, and it'll sound weird maybe and different than what you're used to, but again, this is how I would encourage you to read. Not for memorization, because I don't care if you can memorize these texts, and not for regurgitation, because I don't care if you can regurgitate these texts. What I want is for you to engage with them in a particular way so that you can come back and say, here's what I found most appealing about this argument, here's what I found most challenging, here's what I found most interesting. And so here are some questions. If you want to write these down, great, but every time you're reading, if you're not sure what you should be doing, ask yourself these questions as you're reading and take notes based on this, and of course you're welcome to do more than that. This is what I suggest. 1, what were the most difficult sentences or phrases in the reading? And why were they difficult for you? What did you do to better understand them? But what was difficult about this text? So sometimes people say this text was hard, which is fine, but what was hard about it specifically? Was it the way that he wrote about something? Was it the way that he engaged with the material? Was it the assumptions that he made, or was it the other sources that he used that maybe you weren't familiar with? What specifically was difficult? What sentences? What passages? Next question. What were the most important sentences or phrases in the reading? So that's obviously a question that helps you get down to the basics of why are we doing this, and that's what I try to set up in these videos. But if you can say, in this paragraph, I think the most important thing was this, and it, helped me understand. Once I understood that, I understood the whole thing, or I better understood it. I don't expect you to understand the whole thing necessarily, and I don't think there is one way to understand any of these texts. That's why I'm not interested in whether you can regurgitate or whether you can pass some multiple choice test saying that the definition of whatever, right? What I'm curious about is whether you can read something and interpret and analyze it in an informed way. That's what we're going to practice. If you're not comfortable with doing that right now, totally cool, but eventually you'll get comfortable doing it. Another question. What was the most beautiful passage in the reading? And this is probably something you haven't been asked before, or at least not very frequently, but I think it's important because sometimes people can see the world or articulate the world in such a beautiful or interesting way that it makes you pause and think about it differently. In many cases, I hope that's what you're getting from these readings. So you might not have been doing this before, but please write down as you're reading, or highlight, or do whatever you like, dictate if you prefer that, what was the most beautiful passage or two from the reading. And then, can you think of any contemporary examples that relate to the author's arguments? So especially with Matthew Arnold, for instance, he's not thinking about contemporary situations because he's not contemporary. He's quite old. I mean, he's dead, but if he were still alive, he would be totally different contextually. So what were some of the examples he used, and then what might you put in place? And that's one of the reasons I asked you the questions on the website, which I'll get into in a second. Also, how would your new examples alter or augment the examples and the arguments that the author uses? So for example, if Matthew Arnold's talking about Shakespeare and you want to put in the newest Pulitzer winner, which was my final somewhat trick question. What do you think he would say of the newest Pulitzer? I think there are reasons to say that he would find that high culture as opposed to anarchy, and so I would rate it high on the culture scale. But he would also maybe have issues with the form of representation and the sort of, but not quite, popularity of the Pulitzer, for example, in assessing what's good literature. I think he would like Shakespeare first, the Pulitzer, Whitehead second, and then I think he would think that common apps like TikTok that are not particularly enlightening would be very low on the culture scale, very high on the anarchy scale, which would mean people using that would, if everyone used TikTok and spent their time doing TikTok, I think Matthew Arnold would say, we'd be descending into anarchy. So that's how I would rate those things. Same with the Kardashians. I think reality TV, especially consumerist reality TV shows like that, he would likely rate high on the anarchy level and low on the culture scale. But it's open to interpretation. And I'm not grading these as if, if you didn't put 10 for Shakespeare, then you failed this class or something. I just want you to engage with the material, and that's one of the ways you can do it. So just to reiterate, when I read, and what I encourage you to do when you read, is ask, what were the most difficult sentences and why? What were the most important sentences or phrases and why? What were the most beautiful sentences or phrases and why? And finally, how would you alter the author's arguments with examples of your own? Because that way you'll also know if you understand the text or not. And that's how I would encourage you to read all of the things we're going to read, including this week's readings. So I just want to introduce the idea of culture again. So Raymond Williams, a very important writer, argued that culture is one of the most difficult words to define, and yet the articulation, let me go make sure, because even I don't have this memorized, which I should. But the analysis of culture is the clarification of the meanings and values implicit and explicit in a particular way of life, a particular culture. So Stuart Hall and his co-authors famously did this kind of study with the Walkman, the Sony Walkman. I don't know if you remember this or not. I'm going to put some kind of funny links that demonstrate how we've changed our thinking about certain things. So think about the Walkman. I mean, if you're going to study the Sony Walkman, first of all, if you're not sure what this is, look it up. That goes for everything. Some people ask me what the book was that I mentioned earlier last week. Look it up. You have Google. This is one of the things that change from early times when you might go to college and you would have to go to the library and you would have to consult an index and then you would have to find a book. I mean, you can literally ask Siri now. And so anything you don't know, try to Google it. Although that's not the end if you're writing an essay, but that's a different story. Anyway, if you're trying to study the Sony Walkman, how would you do it? If you were an engineer, I would imagine you would study the technology behind it, what allows us to listen to music while we're moving, while we're active, as opposed to on a record player, for example, or earlier technologies than that. If you were an economist, or if you were a marketer, you might be interested in how is it made, where is it made, how is Japan making it, and how is it being sold in different countries, and what are the price points, and who is able to purchase them, and how many units are being sold per day, per month, per year. Those are the kinds of questions that an economist might ask, and the marketer might ask, how can we sell more, what's effective in different regions, and how has this product been moving, what are the discourses around the product that can help sell it. If you were a politician or a political scientist even, you would probably be interested in how this is going to affect America, for instance, in terms of all of these products from Japan being sold. How is that going to affect our relationship with Japan? Is it going to put us at a competitive disadvantage and these kinds of things? And should we put a tariff on it? And if so, how will that affect other relationships with other countries and free trade and all this stuff, right? That's what a political scientist might ask. If you were an artist, or concerned with art historian, for example, you might ask what kind of music is being produced, how well is it being produced, is it changing because of the availability of the Sony Walkman and these kinds of things, right? None of those things are wrong questions. In fact, all of them are great questions. I would encourage anyone who wants to study something like that to ask those kinds of questions. What would a pop culture scholar ask, or what would a cultural studies scholar ask? That's kind of what Stuart Hall and his co-authors do. they ask, how do you study this from a cultural studies perspective? Among other things, as I said before with Raymond Williams, you want to clarify the meanings and values implicit and explicit in a particular way of life, a particular culture. So what does it mean for people to suddenly have Walkman? Why is that an important step in our culture? How does it affect our culture? Like, think about a few different things, right? For starters, there's this idea that you need music while you're doing anything, while you're jogging, while you're working out, while you're, walking to and from school. That's a very different thing. That totally changed the expectations from before that kind of technology was available. And so that was a cultural change that led to different expectations, different values, because now you can put headphones in and it's kind of a message like, don't talk to me, I'm busy, I don't want to be bothered. And so that's something that has signified differently as technology and as culture changed, right? So the Walkman didn't do that, but it was a part of that cultural change. And that's one of the things that you would better assess or better clarify if you were studying the Walkman. Also, when you think about it, how did it change our expectations of technology, right? The idea used to be that you would go to the record store, maybe, and that you would buy a record, you would put it on your tabletop record player, and you would listen to it, and you would have to be close to it because you'd probably have to change it every 20 minutes or whatever. And so that kind of engagement with music meant that you were probably much more attentive than now if you're working out or if you're in the middle of doing something else and you just want a backbeat, you want something to, rev up your energy if you're jogging or something. That's a totally different way of listening to music, and that's probably, in fact, no, that definitely has changed the way music is produced, at least popular music, right? Some people like Matthew Arnold would probably say popular music has gotten worse and worse and worse because people are just listening to it in the background, whereas they used to really listen to it. And you could read a few other things that we're going to discuss in the future that totally get into that, like Theodore Adorno, who hates popular music because of that, because of those kinds of reasons. But anyway, all of these things change significantly, and asking how the technology fits is only one part of the question. Asking how the pricing and the economic relations fit is only one part of the question. Asking what the lyrics are or what the musical instruments are, small parts of the question. Putting it all together and saying this is what it means to introduce the Sony Walkman and to have it spread culturally in North America, for example, that's a very important distinction in how you study something. So that's what cultural studies is. And in fact, your first assignment, which don't worry about it yet, we'll get into it and I'll explain a lot beforehand. I'll explain all the details. But generally speaking, I want you to do something similar to the Sony Walkman study, although much smaller, but I want you to explain the cultural significance of an item or a practice in a similar way. So you might ask historical questions, you might ask political questions, and you might ask literary questions like what were the devices, what were the functions in terms of writing and representing things, but those are only parts of it. You're going to put it together and say this is what it means to introduce this object into the world, and this is how the object has affected the culture and the culture has affected the object. So obviously, if you watch the videos that are connected to this, you can see how we went from record players to car radios, so suddenly you really needed music in the car. Imagine at the beginning that was unheard of, right? If you were lucky enough to be driving a car, you weren't thinking, I need some tunes. And yet, that's now an expectation. It's so weird to drive, at least for me, without music or at least radio. And then it changed to, not only do I need music at home, but I need music wherever I go. I want to be listening to music, and this is totally me, right? I want to listen to music when I'm writing, I want to listen to music when I'm studying. I have different playlists. And that's another thing, right? I used to, this is how old I am, I would go to the used CD store and buy CDs, and I would listen to those CDs over and over again on my CD player. Now, obviously, you don't have to do that. In fact, it's really weird to think about owning a CD or a tape or a record. I mean, some people still do records, but that's now like a niche market where it totally means something different to own a record today than it did 30, 40 years ago. So now the expectation is that anything I want, I just ask Google and it plays it for me, or I ask Siri or whatever, and that changes how we experience music, it changes how we socially interact, it changes how we let people know what our tastes are, which are probably much more diverse than if you had to literally own the music you listen to. Your music would probably be much smaller in terms of what you were familiar with. So all of these things go to how you study culture. And that's all I want you to do is think about that. I have a few questions, of course, like every week, and I want you to read the readings, think about what was difficult, what was important, maybe what was beautiful or insightful that you got out of the reading, and use that to engage with the questions I'm going to ask. There's also the game that I put up, and that goes with the questions, but I think it's interesting to see what people like and don't like, because in doing so, we can ask ourselves, what were the assumptions I made about why that person might like this or might like that? In some cases, maybe you make gendered expectations, which is not inherently right or wrong, but maybe you use gender as a way to identify something like, I don't think very many women like that, and so she probably doesn't like that either. Or maybe you use race, or maybe you use age, or maybe you use location, like where a person's from, or there are many factors, like he doesn't look like he listens to rock music, or he doesn't look like he listens to hip hop because of the clothes he's wearing, because of the way he talks and the things he does. And so I don't think the hip hop album is the thing that he likes. And you can go on and on like that. Again, stereotypes are, for the most part, bad. You don't want to stereotype people, but you can use cultural assumptions. Like, for example, in the 80s, this person has a Sony Walkman. This person must be making decent money. This person must be like cool. That's definitely what the marketers wanted you to think, right? And so people would do that. When iPhones or when iPods came out, before iPhones, or kind of around the same time, but anyway, they had these white headphones, you might remember. And in fact, we have that now with the more portable, the iPods. But what you see now is totally different than before, but it used to be that the white headphones were a status symbol. And so two things happen that are interesting. One, people would be robbed if they had white headphones because it meant that they had a new Apple product, and so people wanted to get that. And so people would change out and get different headphones sometimes if they didn't want to be robbed. But also the reverse would happen, where people who couldn't afford it, who couldn't afford the newest Apple product, would get white headphones, or maybe they could afford the Apple headphones but not the actual music player. And so they would have this shitty music player, but they would put the nice iPhone or the iTunes stuff in their ears to make it look like they had it, and then they would just hide the actual device. But of course, if anyone wanted to rob them, then they would be disappointed. And so there's all these interesting cultural connections that are made when something is produced and let into the world. And people use it often in ways that are different than it was necessarily intended. And so the last thing I'll say about this is that there is what Stuart Hall has called the circuit of culture. And in the circuit of culture, let me find it on my computer too, so I don't make any mistakes. But in the circuit of culture, this is another great tattoo you could put on yourself, or you could just post it on your wall or something, but it'll help you in everything you do. There's representation, identity, production, consumption, and regulation, right? All of these things interconnect. So, for example, your identity might be tied in some ways to the things that you consume. And so people might produce things, companies, so that these kinds of identities can consume these things. But then they have to worry about regulation, like what's allowed in and not in the country, what's allowed, or what can people purchase with their money, like what is a good price point. And then there's representation, right? So iTunes and the whole Apple industry seemed really cool and innovative until everyone had one, or it seemed like everyone had one, and then it wasn't so cool, and then other things came in, right? Beats by Dre, that was cool and a sort of alternative, but then it got purchased by Apple, and now it's interesting. Like, if I ask you today, are Beats by Dre products cool? You might say yes, but then a year from now you might say no. And that's kind of how this circuit works, right? It's tied to identity and representation, production, consumption, regulation. If that doesn't make perfect sense to you yet, that's totally fine. But I want you to start thinking about how these things are connected. That's the whole point of studying culture. And once you start doing that, once you start asking questions about how economic issues are tied to political issues, or tied to gender, race, and class issues, and a number of other things to consider, then you're probably doing cultural studies. And that's cool. It's complicated, it's difficult, but it's totally worthwhile if you want to understand what's going on around you. So enough for this week. Fill in the questions, do the game, see how you do, and